Kilcoursey, the Unsolved Murder of Father Niall Molloy. On the evening of Sunday, the 7th of July, 1985, three good friends, Richard Flynn, his wife Teresa, and Father Niall Molloy shared drinks together in the master bedroom of the Flynn's home, Kilcoursey House, just outside Clara, County Offaly. Before sunrise the following morning, Father Niall Molloy would lie dead. The culprit made a full admission. However, the Molloy family's 40-year search for truth and justice had only just begun. In this episode, the Garda Technical Bureau and state pathologist arrive on the scene. For the Molloys, confusion still abounds as to what actually happened that night. And all was not as it seemed between the Flynns and Father Niall before his death. Episode 2: Utter Shock and Disbelief. Economically, Ireland was going through a tough recession in the 1980s. Businesses were struggling to stay afloat. Unemployment was at record levels, and most families had a loved one who had left Ireland to make a go of it either in the UK or America. According to the 1981 census, the population of Clara was just over 2,500 people. The Goodbodies, who owned a number of factories in the town from flour mills to textiles, closed down their last factory in 1984, resulting in many job losses. The Catholic Church retained a firm grip over Irish society in the 1980s. Congregations were still large and devout. The church and its priests were highly respected and rarely questioned. However, the church's reputation would be irreparably damaged by scandals that had yet to be exposed. 1980s Ireland also had a repressed attitude towards sex and sexuality. In most people's minds, sex must have been the reason behind Father Niall's death. Without knowing the full details of the case, salacious gossip and rumours ran wild. The Molloy family had suddenly, and in violent circumstances, lost their brother, their uncle, and their loved one at the hands of one of his supposed dearest friends. Public speculation and salacious rumours tarnishing their uncle's name on top of this loss must have been near unbearable. At 8 a.m. on Monday the 8th of July 1985, Maureen returned to Tullamore Hospital to be with her mother. According to Maureen's statement, due to her hysterical state the night before, Teresa had now lost her voice. When the surgical consultant, Mr. Durkin, came to examine Teresa, Maureen was in the private room with her. Maureen would explain to the consultant that she had caused bruising to Teresa's arm. She would also tell Mr. Durkin that she had slapped her mother in the face while trying to calm her down the night before. Maureen would give consent for Teresa to be seen by a psychiatrist. Over the next 3 days, Teresa would have inpatient consultations with Dr. Liam Hannafy, the chief psychiatrist from St. Fintan's Hospital, Portlaoise. He would make a diagnosis of Teresa having an hysterical dissociative reaction, with amnesia being a marked feature. Also that Monday morning, Detective Sergeant John Dunn from Tullamore Garda Station would take possession of the clothes Teresa had been wearing when she was admitted to hospital. A nurse and sister on the ward handed over the items to Detective Sergeant Dunn. He was given a lady's nightdress, a lady's dressing gown, and an orange blanket that was apparently draped around Teresa when she was brought into hospital. Later that Monday morning, the investigating Gardaí from Tullamore returned to Kilcoursey House. They came with the intention of interviewing all the younger members of the Flynn family. When they arrived, David Flynn told the Gardaí that all the younger Flynns had sought the advice of the family solicitor. They had been advised by Mr. Lycett not to make any statements to the Gardaí. When Father Niall was murdered in 1985, a coalition government of Fine Gael and the Labour Party had been in power for nearly 3 years. Garrett Fitzgerald was Taoiseach and had succeeded Fianna Fáil's Charlie Haughey. Dick Spring was the Taoiseach and Michael Noonan was the Minister for Justice. Dublin was not only the capital city and the seat of government, all the major institutions were headquartered there, such as the Gardaí, the Church, the judiciary and the media. The Garda Technical Bureau consisted of Dublin-based investigating Gardaí from different crime scene specialities. Members from the fingerprint section, ballistics section, crime scene photography and the Garda mapping department were all dispatched to Kilcoursey House that Monday morning. The state pathologist, Dr. John Harbison, was also notified that morning, but not until 8:20 a.m. He would then have to make his way down to Clara from Dublin, which was over a 2-hour journey. When the Gardaí from the Technical Bureau arrived, the marquee was still standing. This served as a reminder of the wedding that weekend that would forever be associated with Father Niall's death. Detective Garda Michael Keating, an expert in the examination of crime scenes and ballistics, would spend Monday, the 8th of July, and Tuesday, the 9th of July, examining the scene in Kilcoursey House. On the second day, Tuesday the 9th, Detective Sergeant Edwin Hancock attended to assist Detective Garda Keating in his detailed examination. Inside the house, Detective Keating's first observation was at the top of the stairs. He found blood on the white newel post of the banister just outside the master bedroom, the same observation that Sergeant Ford made when he was the first Garda on the scene. As he approached the master bedroom door, he noticed the exterior side of the door had heavy blood spotting. The position of Father Niall's body meant his left shoulder prevented the master bedroom door from opening fully inwards. The dead man was fully dressed. A tweed jacket was crumpled beside his right foot, and he was lying on his back parallel to the wall of the ensuite bathroom. He looked very neatly laid out. The orange towel Maureen had placed over his face the night before was still covering his face. When Detective Keating removed the towel, he noted wounds to the upper left lip and left side of Father Niall's jaw. Froth was still congealed around his partially open mouth. There was an empty cotton wool container on the floor with 2 pieces of cotton wool and a tissue lying nearby. On the wall above the body, the 2 framed pictures and the wall itself were splattered with blood. Detective Keating also took note of a large blood-stained drag mark on the pale-coloured carpet. The drag mark originated near the foot of the bed and ended within 2 feet of where Father Niall lay over near the door. It measured 8 feet and 5 inches in length, far more substantial than Sergeant Ford's initial estimation of just over 3 feet. Detective Keating described the drag mark as being more heavily stained at both ends. He noted all 3 doors in the room, the main bedroom door, a walk-in closet door, and the ensuite door, all had blood smears and splatters on them, as did their door frames. He found blood splatters low down on the skirting boards adjacent to the walk-in closet near the body. There was a TV on a stand near the foot of the bed with magazines lying on top of the TV. The magazines and the TV screen itself were spotted with blood. Then there were the usual pieces of bedroom furniture one would expect: the double bed, bedside lockers, lamps, a dresser, a freestanding wardrobe, and a rocking chair. As he looked more closely around the room, Detective Keating found further blood splatters and smears. The bed was dishevelled and the bedclothes had bloodstains. A magazine lying on the bed also had bloodstains, as did the footboard of the bed. When Detective Keating entered the ensuite bathroom, he noted blood on the washhand basin and towel rail beside it. There was a smudge of blood on the windowsill behind the sink and more blood on the radiator. Back in the bedroom, Detective Keating found a partially consumed bottle of brandy on the top shelf of the wardrobe. He also found 3 drinking glasses. One of the glasses sitting on the dresser was empty. Another empty glass was found on the ground behind the TV stand, while the third glass, which contained only water, sat on top of the TV itself. Detective Garda Oliver Clunan of the fingerprint section lifted fingerprints from unspecified different items in the room. There is no record in the Garda file as to what these items were or whether any of the items were tested or compared with any of the individuals involved, nor is there any record of anyone in the house that night being fingerprinted by the Gardaí to be used for comparisons. While a detailed examination took place in the master bedroom, Detective Sergeant Hancock examined Father Niall's room, also referred to as the brass bedroom because of its brass double bed. On entering the room, he noticed that the lamp on the left bedside locker had been left on. Beside the lamp, he found the glass of milk Father Niall had taken a sip from the night he died. Father Niall was known to have suffered from stomach ulcers and often drank milk before going to bed to help calm the burning effects. Detective Sergeant Hancock took note of the unmade double bed with its 2 pillows, one on top of the other. There was an undefined stain on the carpet to the left of the bed. One of Father Niall's stubbed-out cigars were found in an ashtray beside the bed. An empty packet of cigars were found in the waste bin under the dressing table. Detective Sergeant Hancock took into evidence the cigar stub, the contents of the glass of milk, a sample of the stain on the carpet, and tape lifts of hairs from the bed and pillows. There is no evidence that the Gardaí made attempts to analyse any of these items. It is also unclear if the Gardaí had been advised by the Flynns that Teresa had been moved into the brass bedroom to be treated by Dr. O'Sullivan on the night in question. Continuing his examination, Detective Sergeant Hancock checked the bathroom directly across the hall from the master bedroom, the bathroom nearest Father Niall's room. He found a yellow towel with a bloodstain on it left draped over the side of the bath. He also placed this towel into evidence to be passed over to the forensic science lab. When he finished examining Father Niall's room, Detective Sergeant Hancock proceeded downstairs to examine the rooms on the ground floor. He found 2 12-gauge shotguns and 14 shotgun cartridges in a small, narrow storeroom off the kitchen. On entering the dining room, Detective Sergeant Hancock noted damage to a large oval dining table. He saw that each of the legs of the table had 3 small brass feet extending from them. One of the brass feet had snapped off and the leg of the table was being propped up by a piece of cardboard. The detached brass foot was sitting on the mantelpiece over the fireplace in the dining room. In the TV room, he noted that a coffee table was cracked in 2 places and the glass top was broken. The coffee table had a wooden frame to hold the glass top and another shelf directly beneath this. Both the main wooden frame and the shelf beneath were cracked in the same vertical location. On the carpet beneath the table, he found glass splinters. There were 2 large pieces of glass which made up most of the tabletop, leaning against a wall in the TV room. However, Detective Sergeant Hancock noticed that there were pieces of glass missing. He found the missing pieces outside in the backyard in a trailer mixed in with food waste. Detective Inspector Monaghan would later recall that the explanation given by the Flynns at the time of the investigation was that 2 children attending the wedding had accidentally damaged the coffee table. Statements were taken from these 2 children at the time. However, these statements do not appear in the Garda file. Detective Sergeant Hancock compiled a statement for the Garda file outlining what he found in each room he examined. He did not mention if he found any traces of blood in any of the rooms on the ground floor in Kilcoursey House. Detective Campbell of the mapping section was tasked with mapping the property itself and all bloodstains in and around the master bedroom. The official Garda Technical Bureau photographer, Detective Garda Byrne, photographed the inside and outside of the house in order to document the scene for the Garda Book of Evidence. As is customary, he placed paper arrows pointing at the splatters and stains to indicate their locations in the photographs. There are only a few detailed notes in the Garda file relating to interpretation of the patterns of blood splatters overall. The main distinction made by Gardaí in relation to the bloodstains found around the scene were some stains were pure blood and others more diluted or watery. The patterns of the watery bloodstains suggested someone had washed their hands and then shook them in a downward direction. 2 small spots of pure blood were found under the doorknob to the walk-in closet. Gardaí noted that the tails of the spots were widest at the bottom and thinner on top, like a teardrop. This pattern would suggest that blood flew upwards before hitting the walk-in closet door. Gardaí surmised these upward patterns could have happened either one of 2 ways. After being dragged across the floor, Father Niall was unceremoniously flipped over onto his back. The act of flipping him over would cause blood to fly upwards. Or, while he was lying on the floor, he was struck again. It could have been a punch, it could have been a kick, but the resulting impact would cause the blood to fly upwards. Some items of physical evidence were also collected from the scene by Gardaí. These included 2 pieces of cotton wool and a tissue that were found on the floor near the body. A button, still attached to fabric that was torn away from Richard's pajama top, and a leaf found under the collar of Father Niall's shirt. Only the cotton wool and its container would be mentioned by the Gardaí in their later testimony. There is no record of results from any analysis of the other items that had been taken into evidence. At noon the same day, Detective Inspector Monaghan from Tullamore Garda Station would return to Kilcoursey House. When he arrived, he was met by Richard's daughter-in-law, Anne. He asked to speak with Richard. Anne said Richard was out on the back lawn and she would go and get him. After a few minutes, instead of Richard coming in, Liam Lycett appeared. Inspector Monaghan, through Mr. Lycett, invited Richard to make a written statement if he wished to do so. Mr. Lycett accepted the photocopy of the Garda notes of the interview with Richard from the night before. He indicated that Richard would not be making any further statement and that the notes taken the night before were fair and accurate and didn't need any enlargement. Under Irish law, Gardaí could not compel someone to talk to them. Father Niall's brother, William Molloy, lived in Castlerea, County Roscommon. At 8:30 a.m. that Monday morning, the parish priest in Castlerea, Father Cregan, knocked on William's door and proceeded to tell him that his brother had had an accident. At first, when he heard the word accident, William thought that his brother had got a kick from a horse. William, along with Father Cregan and another priest, Canon Murray from Athlone, headed straight for Clara to find out what had happened. The 3 men arrived at Clara Garda Station, where they would be redirected to Kilcoursey House. Gardaí were stationed at the front gates. William and the 2 priests briefly spoke to Garda Fox to explain who they were and why they were there. As they approached the house, Richard Flynn came out to meet them. While standing in the driveway, Richard began to apologize. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this had to happen." William asked Richard, "What did happen? My brother came up here as a friend, and I have to come up. He's coming home to me. I no longer have a brother." At this point, Garda Fox asked if William would speak to Richard inside the house. The Garda, stationed in the hallway, showed them into a room downstairs where they could talk privately. The 2 men entered a sitting room and closed the door behind them. Richard sat on the right side of the couch and invited William to have a seat on his left. Richard once again apologized. He said how terribly sorry he was about Father Niall. He then proceeded to tell William that a lot of drink had been taken. It had all started because of a political row. William couldn't understand. He knew his brother and the Flynns were friends for nearly 30 years, but William had never met the Flynns before. Again, he asked, "For God's sake, what happened? You've been friends for so long." William alleged that Richard told him in a hesitant and nervous voice, "Father Niall came in here. There was a political argument going on. He tried to stop the argument and I hit him." Richard's body language was suggesting he was becoming uncomfortable with the questions being put to him by William. Richard didn't make eye contact with William and began to wring his hands in a fidgety way. He then raised his right hand to scratch his face. This is when William noticed the fingernails of Richard's right hand. They had congealed and dried blood under them, and the back of his hand had visible swelling. William grabbed his wrist and asked, "Is this the hand that killed my brother?" With this, Richard tried to pull his wrist away and became very distressed. William claimed that Richard answered yes, and then told him that Father Niall had fallen and hit his head. William, still trying to make sense of what he was being told, probed Richard further. He asked Richard if there was anything else done after that and who did he notify. Instead of answering the questions, Richard lamented, "After 28 years of friendship, why did it come to this?" Then he broke down crying. It was at this point Maureen came into the room with cups of tea and coffee, so William wouldn't get to ask Richard anything further. William politely declined the tea, but Father Cregan had to get back to Castlerea to officiate the funeral of a Garda, so he would have a cup of tea before they headed back. The Gardaí didn't officially record or photograph any injuries Richard claimed to have sustained. Liam Lycett, Richard's solicitor, claimed that he arranged for photos of Richard's injuries to be taken, but no such photos exist in the files. All the while, Father Niall's body lay on the floor of the master bedroom upstairs and would not be moved until the state pathologist arrived. At that time, Dr. John Harbison was the only state pathologist for the Republic of Ireland. This meant he was a busy man as he had to attend the scenes of all unnatural deaths. He arrived at Kilcoursey House on the Monday afternoon and Sergeant Ford showed him upstairs to the murder scene. At 1:47 p.m, Dr. Harbison first viewed the body in situ. Canon Murray, who knew Father Niall all his life, identified the deceased to him as being Father Niall Molloy, with an address in Fjorty, Castlecoot, County Roscommon. Once the Garda photographer had finished taking photos of the body in the room, Dr. Harbison got to work. He noted the position and condition of the body in the room itself. Father Niall was lying on his back, just inside the master bedroom, about 3 feet away from the door saddle. He was fully clothed, wearing a white vest, blue open-collar shirt, a blue round-neck jumper, dark grey trousers, socks and shoes. On the floor by his feet lay a brown herringbone tweed sports jacket. His left leg was lying parallel to the partition wall between the bedroom and ensuite bathroom. His right leg was lying at an angle of 30 degrees away from his left leg. His right arm was fully extended and lying at an angle of around 30 degrees away from his body. His left arm was flexed at the elbow with his forearm lying parallel to his body. His left hand was resting about an inch away from the partition wall. Dr. Harbison then focused on the injuries to Father Niall's face and noted firstly the white froth coming from his mouth. He also noted an injury to the left side of his upper lip and another injury just over the angle of his lower left jaw, below his cheek. Rigor mortis was at this stage well established in the neck, the lower jaw, and in all 4 limbs. At 1:56 p.m, he measured the temperature of the bedroom, which he noted as 21.3 degrees Celsius. He then observed the blood-stained drag mark on the pale, thick carpet. He estimated it to be between 8 and 9 feet in length. The starting point of the drag mark was around 6 feet from the foot of the bed, and it ended about 2 feet from Father Niall's right arm. The darker patch of blood staining nearest Father Niall was in his opinion due to direct bleeding onto the carpet at this end point. He described the remainder of the drag mark as being fainter. To him, it suggested that it had been wiped or smeared. He observed some male and female clothes scattered on the floor and on a chair near the bed. However, Dr. Harbison felt the only area of the room that appeared to be in any disarray was the area around the double bed, which he described as being in a state of slight disorder. At 2:17 p.m., he took the temperature of the body, which he noted as being 31.5 degrees Celsius. Once Dr. Harbison concluded his preliminary inspection of the scene at around 2:30 p.m., he instructed Detective Garda Keating to wrap Father Niall's body in a plastic sheet in preparation to be removed from Kilcoursey House. Garda Fox from Clara Station took official custody of Father Niall's body and accompanied the remains as they were brought by ambulance to Tullamore Hospital for the post-mortem. Dr. Harbison was then approached separately by both Inspector Monaghan and Dr. O'Sullivan, who filled him in on the events that had transpired the night before. There is no mention in official records or in his notes as to what was said or how it may have affected Dr. Harbison's approach to the post-mortem itself. At 4:50 p.m., the post-mortem began with Dr. Harbison opening and removing the plastic sheeting used to wrap the body. He described the body as being that of a late middle-aged male. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a fairly lean build and had receding, greying hair. Dr. Harbison took scrapings from underneath Father Niall's fingernails and took samples of his hair, which he handed over to Detective Garda Keating. The contents of Father Niall's trouser pockets were removed and also handed over to the guards in evidence. This included £115 in cash, his gold watch, a gold chain and a miraculous medal, and 2 sets of Toyota car keys. Father Niall's clothes were removed and also given in evidence to the Gardaí. The Gardaí would later note that Father Niall's clothes were heavily impregnated with carpet fibres, indicating someone had dragged the body. Dr. Harbison began by examining and detailing the external injuries to Father Niall's face. There was white foam coming from the corner of Father Niall's mouth. Beneath the inner surface of the lower eyelid of his right eye were small hemorrhages. These are typically seen in deaths caused by asphyxia, deaths where people struggle to breathe as they die. There were no fractures to the bones of his face, but the cartilage in Father Niall's nose was more mobile than it should have been. In his report, Dr. Harbison would refer to the cuts on Father Niall's face as lacerations. He noted that they were of blunt origin instead of being caused by something sharp, like a knife, for instance. There was a 3/4 inch laceration on the left side of the upper lip near the midline. Near the left angle of the mouth, there was a smaller laceration. This also extended to the upper left lip, and a tiny split on the lower left lip close to the angle of the mouth. There were 2 vertical bruises on his nose, a 1/4 inch long bruise on the left side, and the other on the right side was 3/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, with grazing or an abrasion at its upper end. There was more bruising over his right cheekbone, which had a spotty appearance. A superficial graze was found on the inside of his right ear, which measured a 1/16 of an inch across, and there was also further bruising in this area. On the tip of his chin, just to the left of the midline, there were 2 grazes, one 1/8 of an inch and the other a 1/16 of an inch in length. The most obvious laceration, which Dr. Harbison had already noted when at the scene, was on Father Niall's lower left jaw, a few inches down from the angle of his jaw. Again, it was of blunt origin. It was a deep laceration and measured 3/4 of an inch in length. Dr. Harbison did measure and take note of the dimensions of the cuts to Father Niall's face, but he didn't make any attempt to describe their shape or depth in any further detail. Dr. Harbison moved on and noted that the only injury to Father Niall's upper limbs was a fading bruise on his left forearm, about 3 inches above the wrist, but he felt this bruise was caused a few days before. He found no injuries of a defensive or offensive nature on Father Niall's arms or hands. On his lower limbs, both of his knees had bruises with faded edges. There was a bruise in the middle of his left shin measuring 1.25 inches in length. An abrasion with a flap of skin was found on the inside of his left leg, about 1.5 inches away from his scrotum. Further grazes and abrasions were noted on the inner surface of his lower right leg, just above the ankle. Dr. Harbison did not attribute any cause for the injuries found on Father Niall's lower limbs or when they may have occurred. On turning Father Niall over, he exhibited the normal pattern of purple discoloration on his back from where he had been lying when blood flow stopped. According to Dr. Harbison, at this stage rigor mortis was easily broken down. Next, he would move on to the internal examination of the body, whereby he would detail the severity of the internal injuries Father Niall sustained while being beaten to death. By now, the news of Father Niall's death was starting to reach the other members of the Molloy family. They were in utter shock and disbelief. When Father Niall's sister, Susanna, got the terrible news, she phoned Kilcoursey House to try to find out what had happened. Susanna asked to speak to Teresa Flynn, but the girl who answered the phone told her Teresa was in hospital. The girl on the phone then told her that there had been an accident. Susanna's daughter, also called Susanna, took the phone from her mother and asked who she was speaking to. It was Anne Flynn, David's wife. Anne told Susanna that when she and Maureen left to go to the pub, Father Molloy was at Kilcoursey and seemed fine. Anne went on to describe that when the younger group got back at 1:10, they discovered that Father Niall was dead. The impression Anne got was that he had only died about 10 minutes before their arrival. They found Teresa hysterical. Richard was in a state of shock. As a result, it was difficult to ascertain exactly what had actually happened, but she felt it was obvious a lot of drink was involved. Still not fully understanding what had happened, Susanna told Anne unless she heard anything to the contrary, she would treat Father Niall's death as being caused by a heart attack. Anne, no doubt very relieved, stated that she would appreciate it if they took that approach. Anne told Susanna that she would call her back later. She never would. Meanwhile, the Catholic primate of all Ireland and Archbishop of Armagh, Cardinal Thomas O'Fiach, had been making numerous calls to the Garda station in Tullamore, apparently inquiring as to the circumstances of Father Niall's death. A post-mortem involves the dissection and internal examination of the body and its internal organs. All the main organs are removed, weighed, and their weights and appearances are noted. The final objective is to determine the cause of death. Dr. Harbison would begin at the head and work his way down the body. He observed some internal bleeding in the head, but the skull was intact with no fractures. There was a large blood clot, 1/8 inch thick, under the dura. This is the membrane covering the brain. The brain was removed for further examination at a later date. When the brain was sectioned, traumatic subarachnoid hemorrhage or bleeding was found at the front and back sections of the brain. This happens when blood collects under the skull and seeps into the cerebral fluid that surrounds the brain and the spinal column. It is an acute brain injury caused by trauma. There was internal bleeding in the lower facial area, the jaw and around the right eye socket. No facial bones were broken. There was white froth in the trachea and larynx and watery froth in the lungs and windpipe. There were no signs of injury in the upper torso, the rib cage or the chest, but Dr. Harbison found internal bleeding into the tissue surrounding the left collarbone. There was an old scar on the abdomen. The stomach lining had slight inflammation at the upper end. Other than that, there was nothing abnormal. The stalk of the left kidney had internal bleeding, but the kidney itself was not damaged. Examination of the heart showed the tissue surrounding the heart was healthy. There was, however, a small area near the coronary artery that had some scar tissue and calcification. Samples of these areas were taken and sent for histology. There was no evidence of any recent muscle tissue death, which is usually a sign a heart attack took place. Toxicology revealed an alcohol level of 134.7 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. Dr. Harbison felt that these levels fell within the limits of ordinary social drinking and would not constitute inebriation. This would tie in with claims from Father Niall's family that he was not a heavy drinker. He was more likely to drink moderately and socially. The inflammation of the stomach lining accounts for him drinking milk before bed. Dr. Harbison continued to outline the importance of some of his other findings. He found substantial pulmonary oedema in Father Niall's lungs. This means the lungs were very waterlogged, hence why there was froth coming from the mouth. The medical profession referred to this condition as cerebral lung, as excess fluid builds up in the lungs due to a head trauma. Dr. Harbison felt the oedema or fluid was likely associated with the head injuries. There are other causes of pulmonary oedema, including heart failure or the inhalation of vomit, but Dr. Harbison did not find any evidence to suggest Father Niall had vomited. As for heart failure, Dr. Harbison felt that Father Niall's heart was slightly enlarged, but he described the enlargement as minimal, even within the upper limits of normal. Father Niall's heart weighed 400 grams and showed signs of normal degenerative changes in a man of 52 years of age. There was no further evidence to suggest heart failure. If anything, Father Niall's heart continued to pump blood around his body after he was beaten, causing the extensive internal bleeding. Dr. Harbison would conclude his post-mortem report with the following findings. Father Niall sustained multiple injuries to the head, neck, and principally the face. The distribution of these injuries was consistent with Father Niall having been the recipient of 5, 6, or more blows from an object such as a fist. However, he deemed the violence was insufficient to fracture any facial bones. The cause of death was certified as being from an acute swelling to the brain and acute subdural hemorrhage, both arising from receiving head injuries. The time of death was given as between late on the night of the 7th of July or in the very early hours of the 8th of July 1985. He would not be any more specific. When Dr. Harbison completed the post-mortem at 10 p.m., Detective Garda Keating handed over Father Niall's possessions to Garda Michael Fox from Clara Garda Station. On Tuesday, the 9th of July at 11 a.m., two Gardaí, Detective Sergeant John Dunn and Thomas Dunn, went to see Teresa Flynn in Tullamore Hospital. This was less than 2 days after Father Niall's death. When the Gardaí arrived on the ICU ward, Teresa's sister was visiting with her. Teresa had no objections and agreed to speak with the two guards. This would be the only time she would speak directly to Gardaí without legal representation present. A formal statement was not taken from Teresa at this time. Detective Sergeant John Dunn merely took notes of the interview and Teresa did not sign them. For around 30 minutes, she would relay to the two Gardaí what she could remember of the events from 2 nights before. Detective Sergeant Dunn described her demeanour during the interview as being composed and lucid. However, some of the details Teresa had given to the Gardaí in her first interview would change slightly in the official statement Mr. Lyce had presented to Gardaí on Teresa's behalf less than a week later. In the interview conducted from her hospital bed, Teresa recalled that the Sunday lunch finished by 7 p.m. In Teresa's official statement, the time lunch finished changed to 5 p.m. Teresa next told the two guards that Anita stayed back with Maureen to keep Aunt May company when everyone else left the house. Teresa, Richard and Father Niall arrived back at Kilcoursey House at 9:15 p.m. This would also change in Teresa's official statement to a slightly later time of 9:30 p.m. The remainder of the information Teresa told the Gardaí from her hospital bed would match what she would eventually provide in her official statement. Detective Sergeant John Dunn noted that the interview with Teresa had been relaxed and courteous. Nothing contentious arose. As the Gardaí were leaving, they overheard Teresa tell her sister that they were very nice. Both the note of Teresa's interview with Gardaí in hospital and her official statement were entered into the Garda Book of Evidence. Teresa would never be asked to explain or address why some of the details in her story had changed. About 6 months before Father Niall was killed, Richard and Teresa stayed over as guests at his house in Castlecoot. This wasn't unusual per se, but it wasn't very frequent either. The next morning they attended Mass celebrated by Father Niall. Richard and Teresa were well known in Castlecoot as Father Niall's close friends. After Mass, Father Niall and Teresa travelled to a horse show in County Mayo, while Richard made his way home to Kilcoursey. Later that day, at around 3 p.m, a local farmer in Castlecoot found what he believed to be the proceeds of the church collection in a ditch near one of his fields. It came to around £15 in loose change. Local Garda Kieran Connell was notified and found that there had been a burglary at Father Niall's house. The burglar first tried to force the locked back door, but eventually gained entry through the front door, which had been left unlocked. When Garda Connell examined the house and where the church collection had been kept, he found that there was even more money still there, but left untouched. When Father Niall was asked by Garda Connell if anything was missing, the only thing he could report was that his oak desk had been prized open. Some of his personal papers were missing from the top right-hand drawer. There were no other items stolen, and nothing else was disturbed. Garda Connell described it as the strangest burglary he ever investigated. William Molloy's wife, Carmel, Father Niall's sister-in-law, later recalled details of a conversation she had had with Father Niall just after the burglary. Father Niall told Carmel that other than personal papers and business documents, nothing else had been taken, despite there being more money and other valuables in the house. He was extremely upset over the incident and had hinted to her that the burglar was not a stranger. Carmel remembered Father Niall told her that he was going to sell everything he owned and ask for a transfer to the missions in South America. She described him as being dispirited after the burglary, and he mentioned to a number of people that he was thinking of retiring. Leading up to the weekend of the wedding in Kilcoursey, Father Niall was observed by his family and friends and some parishioners as not being quite himself. On the 8th of June, 1985, a month before he was killed, Father Niall last saw his sister Susanna. She felt he was not his usual self, and she noticed some damage to the rear of his car. He explained that a woman had backed into his car in a supermarket car park and made no more about it. He didn't mention any issues or problems he may have had, but she did sense something was not quite right. His sister was worried about him, so she called him the following week. She asked whether anything was wrong with him or whether he wanted to talk about anything. Father Niall reassured her that he was fine, everything was all right, and if he needed to speak to her, if he were worried, he would. Susanna made a point of phoning and checking in with Father Niall every Sunday, but the last time she tried to phone him on the 7th of July, there was no answer. He was at an after-wedding luncheon in Kilcoursey. Around 2 weeks before Father Niall was killed, he met with his cousin, Martin Molloy, to conduct some business. Father Niall was 4 years older than Martin. They grew up together and were both very much into horses. Martin's daughter regularly competed against one of Teresa's daughters in show jumping competitions. They would often bump into each other at horse shows, and he described Father Niall and Teresa as both being fairly shy. When Martin sold a horse to Father Niall in the past, he received a cheque for payment drawn down from an account in the joint names Niall Molloy and Teresa Flynn. On this occasion, Father Niall had contacted Martin asking him to buy some cattle for him. While they were talking, Martin noticed Father Niall had a black eye, and to him it looked a few days old. When Martin asked him about it, Father Niall told him that the black eye was caused by a member of the Flynn family, but he didn't go into any further detail other than to say that he wasn't a very nice person. They continued on with the business at hand, and Father Niall bought 12 cattle. Martin met Father Niall again at Kilcoursey when he delivered the cattle, and payment was made by way of a cheque, again from the joint account of Niall Molloy and Teresa Flynn. Before Martin left, Father Niall mentioned that he would, in the future, get him to buy more cattle for him, but not until after the upcoming wedding on the 6th of July. He told his cousin he was going to sell a couple of his horses and then take a long holiday in South America. Then he told Martin he was getting out of horses altogether and dissolving the business he had with Teresa. This was the reason he gave for buying the cattle. They were quicker and easier to sell than the horses. Martin stated that when Father Niall told him all this, he didn't press him for any details. Just 2 weeks before his death, Father Niall was named Roscommon Man of the Year. He was awarded the title for all his hard work in the community and parish of Kilcoursey and for his efforts in reviving the traditional Roscommon hunt, which had not been active for 40 years. However, instead of this being a boost to his demeanour, to his friends he appeared troubled. 4 days before Father Niall was killed, Johnny Gallagher, a friend of his in Kilcoursey, saw Father Niall outside the local shop and jumped down off his tractor to have a chat. Father Niall asked Johnny to sit in his car for a minute. Johnny asked if he was all right. Father Niall said, "I'm not looking forward to this weekend. It's a private matter I can't discuss." Then Father Niall told Johnny he was thinking of retiring. Johnny offered his support and help. Father Niall thanked him, but said, "There's nothing you can do." Just a few days before he was killed, Father Niall spoke over the phone with a friend of his, a fellow curate. He asked the curate to pray for him as he was facing what he described as a situation which he did not relish. The day before he was killed, the day of the big wedding in Kilcoursey, Father Niall attended a funeral in Athleague, County Roscommon, that morning. There he met a friend we had known all his life, Tom Smith. Tom had been the best man at William Molloy's wedding and also happened to be the undertaker in Kilcoursey. Father Niall and Tom shared an interest in horses, and they frequently met at horse shows around the country. Because of this interest in horses, Tom also knew Teresa Flynn. They had a brief chat, and Father Niall told him that he had to go to a wedding in Clara that afternoon, and that he wasn't looking forward to it. Father Niall didn't go into the reason why. Curate is the title given to the members of the clergy who assist a parish priest. The definition of the word curate means a person who is invested in the care of the souls in their parish. Father Niall held the position of curate to his parish priest, Father Jones, but also, without question, he was most invested in all the souls of his parish, young and old. He was a kind-hearted and gentle soul. He may have been quiet and a bit reserved, but he was also very easygoing, with a wonderful sense of humour, and was a treasured friend to all who knew him. Everyone in Kilcoursey was shaken to the core and couldn't understand what had happened. Johnny Gallagher, on behalf of the development committee that Father Niall had established in Kilcoursey, contacted the Molloy family. Because Father Niall was so beloved, his parishioners asked if he could be interred on the grounds of the church in their parish. Father Niall's funeral mass was held on Wednesday, the 10th of July, 1985. It was a huge funeral, and every media outlet in the country and abroad had a journalist or correspondent waiting outside the church. The mass was celebrated by Father Niall's superior and family friend, Dominic Conway, the Bishop of Elphin. Over 100 priests from Father Niall's diocese were in attendance. After the funeral mass, Father Niall's coffin was carried outside and he was laid to rest in a grave in front of the church on the grounds. When Richard Flynn was recognised leaving the church, there were reported scuffles with the media. The Molloy family and mourners then gathered for refreshments after the funeral as is customary. They shared stories and memories of their brother and uncle, but were all still in utter shock and totally bewildered as to what had happened to him, especially at the hands of his closest friends. Regardless of what Richard Flynn had tried to claim, the Molloys knew Father Niall was not political, nor was he a heavy drinker. They couldn't believe Father Niall was involved in any violent altercation. Around the time of the funeral, Bill Maher, a nephew of Father Niall, received a call from a solicitor friend of his. His friend wanted to pass on his sympathies, but also to tell Bill that Father Niall had dealings with another solicitor in their office in Fr and Merthyrs at Lone. Father Niall had been in to see his colleague the Friday before he was killed. Father Niall had left behind a number of personal possessions, some which were quite valuable. He and Teresa also jointly owned at least 10 show-jumping horses with a combined value of over £70,000. They were all stabled at Kilcoursey, and one in particular, Stepaside, was considered a thoroughbred. Martin Molloy, Father Niall's cousin, who sold them cattle previously, was at one time an insurance salesman. In the early 1970s, he visited Tubber House to give Richard a quotation for a home insurance policy for the property. Richard provided the tour of the house to enable a valuation of its contents. The tour included being shown Father Niall's bedroom and office. In Father Niall's room, Martin was shown 4 or 5 paintings on the walls by the famous Sligo artist Jack Yeats. Beautiful leather saddles and bridles were on display in the office. Richard pointed out to Martin he was not to include any of the personal items in these rooms in the insurance quote as they belonged to Father Niall. Father Niall had been left a substantial amount of Roadstone shares by his father, and his family were aware that he also owned some items of value. They now began to ask amongst themselves where Father Niall's will could be filed. It was normal practice for a serving clergyman to lodge a copy of his will with his solicitor and his bishop's office. Father Niall's sister, Susanna Ryan, and her daughter Susanna subsequently called Fr and Merthyrs solicitor's office in Athlone on Friday, the 12th of July. They inquired if Father Niall had lodged his will with them. The solicitor, Mr. Egan, advised them there was no will lodged with him, but that he needed to speak to Father Niall's family about an urgent matter. He recommended that they come and see him, so he made an appointment for them for the following Monday, the 15th of July. The Molloy family reached out to the office of the Bishop of Elphin, inquiring about the will. They were told that the bishop's office had no record of a will belonging to Father Niall ever being received or deposited with them. The army should have had a copy of the will from when Father Niall served in Cyprus. However, it was later established, as he was no longer chaplain with the army, the Command Adjutant's Office of the Army Barracks in Athlone should have forwarded Father Niall's will to the office of the Bishop of Elphin in Sligo. Father Niall's nephew, Bill Maher, recalled a year before his death, his uncle popped into his shop. He mentioned he was up in Dublin to see his solicitor, Liam Lycett. Bill knew of Mr. Lycett, and Father Niall joked that Lycett came from a strong Fine Gael family. Father Niall knew him so well, he thought he may be able to secure a position in the law firm for a relative of theirs who was finishing up their law degree. The Molloy family then tried to contact Mr. Lycett at his office, but he never returned their calls. They would find out a few days later that Mr. Lycett was firmly representing the Flynn family. During their forensic examination of Kilcoursey House, the Gardaí removed a number of items they submitted to be examined by the Forensic Science Lab. In the days following Father Niall's death, Richard called to the local Garda station on a number of occasions. He angrily complained about their seizing a brown herringbone tweed sports jacket that he wanted back. The jacket had been found lying at Father Niall's feet. Detective Garda Michael Keating had taken the jacket into evidence and passed it on to Dr. Maureen Smith in the lab for analysis on the 11th of July. On the 16th of July, Dr. Smith returned the jacket to Detective Michael Keating, presumably to be returned to Richard Flynn. The Gardaí decided to hold on to the 2 shotguns retrieved from a storeroom downstairs in Kilcoursey House. They felt Richard shouldn't be in possession of firearms at that time, as they were concerned about the stresses he was under. Gardaí would eventually return the guns. On Thursday, the 11th of July, the day after Father Niall was buried, Teresa Flynn was discharged from Tullamore Hospital. She went to stay with her son David in Tubber House for a few days, rather than return to Kilcoursey House. At 5 p.m. that evening, as the Gardaí had now completed their examination of the scene, they gave back Kilcoursey House to Maureen and Zandra. That same evening, William Molloy and members of the Molloy family travelled to Clara Garda Station in order to collect the personal belongings Father Niall had on him the night he died. Detective Sergeant Dunn and Sergeant Ford handed over 2 sets of car keys, a sum of cash, a gold chain with a miraculous medal, and a gold Favre-Lube Swiss watch worth about £200. When the Gardaí handed over the watch, members of Father Niall's family noticed that the glass on the front was broken. The Gardaí didn't mention or discuss the condition of the watch with the family. They just handed it over with all the belongings in a plastic bag. Later, the Molloys had a proper look at the watch and they discovered the glass was pressing down on the hands, preventing them from moving. The watch was stopped at the time 10:40. Still in shock, the Molloys didn't realize at first the significance of what was given back to them. Then they began to wonder, could the watch have been broken when Father Niall was struck? If so, it would suggest the altercation took place much earlier that evening than the Flynns tried to claim. 2 days later, William went back to Clara to return the watch to the Gardaí, pointing out it was stopped at 10:40. The Gardaí noted it was stopped at 10:40, taking receipt of the watch again. After a few days, the Gardaí returned the watch to the Molloys again, stating that it was of no significance. Because the Gardaí handed back the watch to Father Niall's family, it could never be admitted as a significant piece of evidence. It was now useless. The chain of custody had been broken. Any potential forensics had been contaminated, and any opportunity to inspect or analyse the damage to the watch now became redundant. The Gardaí, dismissing the watch as evidence, continues to this day to be one of the most troubling aspects of the case for the Molloy family. At 7:50 p.m. on Monday the 15th of July, a week after the murder, Detective Sergeant Dunn from Tullamore Gardaí requested that Dr. O'Sullivan take blood samples from both Richard and Teresa at his surgery in Kilbeggan. Detective Sergeant Dunn cautioned both Richard and Teresa and advised that they didn't have to provide samples, but they both consented, with Richard stating, "I have nothing to hide." The Gardaí had previously confiscated the nightclothes Richard had been wearing. His pajama top was missing a button. The button was still attached to fabric when it was ripped away. The button and fabric were found by Gardaí in a flower pot in the bedroom. There was also a tear under the arm of Richard's pajama top. While Teresa was still in hospital, the nursing staff handed over the nightclothes she had been wearing on admission. Dr. Maureen Smith of the State Forensic Science Lab would analyse the blood on these clothes as well as on the bedding from the master bedroom. She was provided with blood samples from Richard, Teresa and Father Niall for comparisons. Father Niall's sister, Susanna, and her daughter, Susanna, visited the office of Fr and Murtha's solicitors in Athlone on Monday the 15th of July, as had been arranged. The solicitor in the office, Mr. Egan, explained that Father Niall had a business association with Teresa and he had acted on their behalf on a number of transactions since 1972. He asked the ladies if they had any knowledge of this, but they didn't. They were only aware that there was a friendship between Father Niall and the Flynns due to a mutual interest in horses. The solicitor went on to explain that a year before, in 1984, Father Niall, along with Teresa and Richard, came to his office. They explained to Mr. Egan that Richard and his son David were in financial difficulty with their chain of businesses and they needed money fast. Richard had begun to experience financial problems with his businesses, and by 1983 he was over £23,000 in debt to both revenue and banks. In order to alleviate some of his financial problems, Richard, Teresa and Father Niall had begun the process of buying land in Letter Frack in County Galway with plans to develop the site. This deal fell through because the Land Commission would not approve their plans. The same day as they got word that the Letter Frack deal had fallen through, they came up with a new plan and contacted Fr and Murtha's to help put this one into action. On the 7th of September 1984, a contract was drawn up for Father Niall and Teresa to purchase land from Richard at Kilcoursey. There was a suggestion that Father Niall and Teresa would develop the site for equestrian purposes, and even Father Niall could build a house there for his retirement. They agreed on a price of £35,000 and that a deposit of £24,000 would be payable immediately. Mr. Egan remembered Father Niall was a bit hesitant and showed signs of reluctance, but Teresa reassured him that once the deal was done, he would own land at Kilcoursey, but if anything went wrong, he would get his deposit back. Father Niall's share of this deposit was £12,000, and he paid it directly to the vendor, Richard Flynn, there and then, by agreement and subject to Land Commission consent. No one questioned the fact that Teresa was actually buying land she technically already owned. It's not known where Teresa got the money for her half of the deposit. Gardaí would later suspect that either Teresa's half came from the joint business account or that Father Niall fronted the full amount himself. On the 14th of February 1985, Mr. Egan received word from the Land Commission and it wasn't the result the Flynns had hoped for. Mr. Egan wrote to Father Niall on the 19th of February 1985. He advised him that the Land Commission was not forthcoming with consent and as a result, the deal to buy land at Kilcoursey would not be going ahead. Father Niall tried to approach Richard and Teresa about getting his money back, but he wasn't getting anywhere. He then started to express serious concerns about getting his deposit back. Father Niall visited and contacted Mr. Egan on a number of occasions before his death to try to recover his money. Because Mr. Egan acted for both parties, Father Niall and Teresa, he advised Father Niall to seek independent legal advice. Father Niall had attended Mr. Egan's office the Friday before he was killed, giving instructions to cut all formal business ties with the Flynns. Mr. Egan concluded his meeting with Father Niall's sister and her daughter by telling them that on the previous Friday, after he spoke with them and arranged the appointment, he had also received a call from Teresa Flynn. He told Teresa that some of Father Niall's family were coming in to see him. Teresa wanted to know if Mr. Egan was obliged to inform the Molloy family of the land deal and transactions. Mr. Egan answered yes. He was obliged to tell the Molloys. When Richard Flynn was initially cautioned and questioned by Gardaí, he refused to sign the notes of his conversations with them on the night. He told Gardaí that he would supply a statement the following day. For the next week, despite many requests from Gardaí, no statement was forthcoming. On the evening of Monday, the 15th of July, Liam Lycett gathered up 8 pre-prepared written statements, all witnessed by him and signed by members of the Flynn family. He then travelled to Tullamore Garda Station and presented them to Detective Inspector Thomas Monaghan. Richard's pre-prepared statement would not provide any further insight into what had happened the night Father Niall was killed. He stated, "I refer to the notes taken by Inspector Monaghan and Sergeant Ford of my conversation with them on the 8th of July. A copy of these notes has been made available to me and I have carefully read them. They represent a correct description of what occurred and record accurately what I told Inspector Monaghan and Sergeant Ford. I have nothing to add to what is contained in these notes." On the 16th of July, Garda Michael Gillespie paid a visit to Mr. Durkin, the surgical consultant who cared for Teresa Flynn during her admission in Tullamore Hospital. Garda Gillespie requested a copy of Teresa's medical notes. Mr. Durkin advised that he would provide a copy, but only if he got consent from Teresa first. At the time of the land deal in Letterfrack, a life accident insurance policy was taken out on Father Niall's life. The initial policy, taken out on the 31st of May 1984 with the Combined Insurance Company of Ireland, was only for 6 months. The next policy, dated the 30th of November 1984, was taken out as the first one was due to expire. The applicant section on the form has the signature of Niall Molloy. Or Flynn stated on the form his relationship to Father Niall was brother-in-law. And in the next of kin section was Teresa's signature. She described her relationship to Father Niall as sister. A week after Father Niall was killed, his nephew, Ian Maher, decided to call to see Dr. O'Sullivan at his home in Kilbeggan. Ian hoped to get some answers. Dr. O'Sullivan told Ian that on the night he had forgotten to bring the phone up with him from the surgery. The first thing he knew was at 1:15 a.m, and he was very specific about this. He said that his front door was hammered on very loudly at 1:15. When he went down to answer the door, it was David. Ian didn't know who David was at this stage. On his way back to Dublin, Ian stopped at a nearby hotel and phoned his brother Bill. He told him the details of the conversation he just had with Dr. O'Sullivan, and he asked Bill if he knew who David was. Bill didn't know either. Ian felt this information was sufficiently important to call the Gardaí to report the conversation, even though he may not have fully understood its significance. He spoke to Garda Michael Fox in Clara Garda Station. Ian relayed the story he was told by Dr. O'Sullivan, and when he got to the part about who was at the door, Garda Fox asked him to say that again. Ian repeated, the first person to call to Dr. O'Sullivan's house was David. And who's David? Garda Fox answered, that's Richard Flynn's son. On Thursday, July 18th, Father Niall's sister Susanna gave a detailed statement to Detective Inspector McCaffrey and Detective Sergeant Dunn of Tullamore Gardaí. She outlined her close relationship with her youngest brother and her concerns after she last met him. Susanna explained she thought he was in bad form when he last visited. Because it was so unlike him, it made her worried. She explained she would call him on Sundays to check in on him and that she didn't get to speak to him the last time she called. Susanna passed on the information she received from Mr. Egan at Fair and Murtha's. She wanted all of the information about land deals and a missing deposit on the record in the hopes of it helping the investigation. Susanna also included in her statement Teresa's phone call to Mr. Egan the Friday before their appointment and her asking Mr. Egan, when it came to their financial dealings, if he was obliged to inform the Molloys. On Friday, July 19th, Inspector Monaghan and Detective Sergeant Dunn drove from Tullamore Garda Station to David's home, Tubber House, to interview Richard. Richard insisted David remain in the room for the interview. Detective Sergeant Dunn formally cautioned Richard in relation to his right to silence. It was put to Richard that the Gardaí were now investigating suggestions that he owed Father Niall a large sum of money, and that Father Niall had expressed serious concern about getting his money back. Richard told the Gardaí that he would not make a statement without his solicitor being present. Within 5 minutes, the Gardaí were back in their car and driving back to the station. On Monday, the 22nd of July, Father Niall's niece, Susanna, met with Detective Thomas Dunn. She also provided a statement of the whole story she had heard from Mr. Egan about the Flynns, the business deals, and the missing deposit. That same day, the Gardaí would receive a phone call from Mr. Durkin, the surgical consultant in Tullamore Hospital. He was getting back to the Gardaí in relation to their request for Teresa's medical records. The consultant explained that he had received instructions from Teresa's solicitor not to provide a copy of Teresa's medical records to the Gardaí. The following day, Tuesday the 23rd of July, Detective Inspector Monaghan and Detective Sergeant Dunn went back to Kilcoursey, this time with the intention of interviewing Teresa. In the presence of her solicitor, Liam Lysett, Teresa explained that she couldn't recall any details of the events that led up to Father Niall dying. She had nothing further to add to the prepared statement her solicitor had handed into the Gardaí. It was then put to her that Gardaí were investigating allegations that Father Niall had been concerned about getting his deposit back. Teresa accepted there had been a business deal between her, her husband, and Father Niall. She admitted Father Niall had agreed to buy the land from Richard and had paid him a deposit of £12,000. Teresa claimed the idea to buy the land at Kilcoursey was actually Father Niall's, so he would have somewhere to build a house for his retirement. She stated that about 2 months before his death, she repaid Father Niall £11,000 of the £12,000 deposit in cash, herself, from a safe in the house. She didn't want Father Niall to be worrying. When asked by Gardaí to provide some form of proof she repaid Father Niall, Liam Lysett would concede that Teresa couldn't produce any proof. She had no receipts or bank statements to substantiate her claims. It would also later come to light there was never a safe in Kilcoursey House. The Minister for Justice at the time of Father Niall's death was Michael Noonan. Minister Noonan claimed he was told in the summer of 1985 by a TD from Laois, Offaly, that no one would ever stand trial for Father Niall's murder. The minister was so concerned by this that he went to the Secretary-General of the Department of Justice to report what he had been told. Before the Garda investigation was concluded, 2 Gardaí from Dublin Castle were sent to Athlone to interview Mr. Egan in Fair and Murtha's solicitors. They took a statement from Mr. Egan, but for unknown reasons his statement was not included in the Garda file. The Garda file contains the book of evidence, which includes the photographs taken at the scene and maps of the property, both inside and out. Also included were Dr. Harbison's post-mortem report, the independent witness statements obtained by the Gardaí, and the pre-prepared statements from the Flynns. Gardaí, however, did not obtain a guest list from the wedding or the lunch the next day, so they didn't interview any of these potential witnesses. They didn't acquire a copy of the wedding video either. Routine door-to-door inquiries were not carried out. No phone records for Kilcoursey House were ever sought. No one involved appeared to have been fingerprinted for comparisons. Medical and hospital staff who tended to Teresa in Tullamore Hospital were never questioned. The owners and patrons of Paddy White's pub, which was referred to in statements from Flynn family members and who could vouch for their whereabouts, were never interviewed to corroborate. When the Gardaí compiled their book of evidence, they provided an introduction with some background on the victim, the suspect, and witnesses. In describing Richard Flynn's background, they wrote that he attended daily mass and never once came under unfavourable notice of the Gardaí until this present incident. Both himself and his family were highly regarded in the local community. In concluding the introduction for their file, the Gardaí further stated, while Richard Flynn has given a motive for the incident which led to the death of Father Niall Molloy, that is, a stupid argument over drink, it is difficult to accept this as being the true cause of such a violent attack leading to the priest's death. The only known eyewitness to the incident is Mrs. Teresa Flynn. She has given a prepared statement which fails to throw any light on the cause of Father Molloy's death. In this area, the investigating Gardaí found themselves in a most unusual position in that they could not interview Mrs. Teresa Flynn except when her solicitor, Mr. Lycett, was present. This is the same solicitor who represents the chief suspect, Richard Flynn. Under the heading Motive, the Gardaí would advise, in the absence of any explanation supported by evidence, one can only speculate as to the motive for this crime. In his original statement to the Gardaí, Richard Flynn stated it was an argument over drink. However, in a conversation with William Molloy, Richard Flynn stated, "I had a terrible lot of drink taken," and a political row started. During the course of the investigation, the Gardaí learned that Richard Flynn owed a substantial amount of money, £11,000, to Father Niall Molloy. On July 31st, 1985, the Gardaí, now satisfied they had concluded their investigation, forwarded their file to the Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Eamon Barnes. Eamon Barnes was appointed the first Director of Public Prosecutions for the Irish State in 1975. Before this, the Attorney General's Office prosecuted cases on behalf of the state. The Office of the DPP holds the responsibility of reviewing Garda files with a view to deciding whether to bring a prosecution or not. On the 5th of August, not even a month since Father Niall was killed, a handwritten letter was received in the Claims Department of the Combined Insurance Company of Ireland. It read the following: "Dear Sirs, I have a policy on the life of Father Niall Molloy, policy number 9257958, with your company. This man is now dead. I wish to make a claim on the policy. Please let me have the necessary forms. Yours faithfully, Mrs. Teresa Flynn, Kilcoursey, Clara, County Offaly." The claims handler in Combined Insurance Company of Ireland replied to Teresa's letter and included the appropriate forms in order for her to pursue the claim on Father Niall's life. He also requested a copy of the death certificate, a doctor's statement, and details of letters of administration from Father Niall's estate. The handler followed up on numerous occasions with written reminders of the required documentation in order to process the claim. He would never receive a reply. The Royal Dublin Society, or RDS, has an annual horse show every August. Their August 1985 catalogue included a thoroughbred horse called Stepaside, listed for sale, and the entry by Mrs. Orr Flynn detailing the registration in her name and the provenance of the horse. When the RDS were asked about the sale of the horse, they advised they had no detailed knowledge, but that most of their sales were made to buyers in Europe. It later transpired that Mr. Francie Kearns, a close friend of Teresa and Father Niall, who jumped horses for them, was the person they trusted to buy and sell the horses for their partnership. He had been instructed to sell Stepaside at the RDS a few weeks after Father Niall was killed. Mr. Kearns claimed that Stepaside was sold to a doctor from Blackrock in County Dublin. After Stepaside was sold, 9 jointly owned horses remained at Kilcoursey House. On the 20th of August, after careful consideration of the Garda file and Book of Evidence, the DPP, Eamon Barnes, directed Richard Flynn be prosecuted for manslaughter and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. A week later, 60 of Father Niall's parishioners gathered in the Castlecoot School for a community meeting. They were disgusted with the innuendo and salacious rumours going around in the 7 weeks since Father Niall was killed. The parishioners of Castlecoot wanted to help restore Father Niall's reputation and staunchly defended him as being gentle, shy, and deeply religious. They simply could not conceive of him breaking his vows of celibacy or of any scandalous affair being the reason for his death. William Molloy attended the meeting. He explained that he was trying to conduct his own investigations because he felt he and his family still didn't know what had happened to Father Niall. He stated, "I want the true facts to be made known, so that Niall's name, which has been smeared by institutions, can be cleared." Richard Flynn was summoned to appear in Kilbeggan District Court on 2 counts on the 25th of September 1985. The square in Kilbeggan was full of locals who turned out to watch despite the rain. The media swarmed the place while the court itself was packed. Father Niall's family, parishioners and friends travelled from Castlecoot and from all over the country to attend. Father Niall's superior, Bishop Conway of Elphin, also attended. Richard was formally charged with manslaughter and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. He was represented by his solicitor, Liam Lysett, and only made a 2-minute appearance. The solicitor appointed by the DPP, Mr. James Houlihan, entered an application for an adjournment of the charges. He explained the state needed more time to prepare the book of evidence. Justice William Tormey asked if the state could be ready for the next sitting of the court on the 23rd of October. Mr. Houlihan said he was hopeful it would be ready well in advance of that. Justice Tormey then granted the application. Afterwards, Richard and his solicitor hurried past the cameras and back to their car without any comment. An article about the brief hearing was published by Frank Currell in the Irish Independent the following day. He wrote that Richard had recently collected the summons personally from the Garda station in Clara after he got back from a holiday in Normandy. After her discharge from hospital, Teresa phoned Father Niall's sister, but after a few moments claimed she was too upset and couldn't continue the conversation. Apart from this call, no one from the Flynn family reached out to the Molloys, despite William writing to the Flynns many times. Ian also tried calling to Kilcoursey House to hand-deliver a sympathy card, but despite there being cars parked outside, no one answered the door. Ian pushed the card through the letterbox. William did receive a letter from Douglas Goodbody not long after Father Niall died. Instead of offering his sympathies, Mr. Goodbody explained that Father Niall had been given a fireside poker, tongs, and a fender of his to be brought for repairs. Mr. Goodbody was now requesting the return of his property. William tracked down the items and passed them on to the Gardaí to give them back, as he didn't want anything further to do with the Goodbodies. Encouraged by the attendance of some of the clergy at Richard's court appearance, William wrote a letter of appreciation to Bishop Conway. Bishop Conway was not only Father Niall's superior, but he had taught Niall and was considered a friend of the Molloy family. William told the bishop he was pleased to see him at the court hearing and hoped he and other priests would continue to show up for hearings and, as William put it, to be seen to be associated with the side of one of their own. In his letter to the bishop, William also mentioned a rumour he had heard about the DPP, Eamon Barnes. He had heard that the DPP had stood as godfather to one of the Flynn children, and William was wondering about the validity of the rumour. William claimed he got a snotty reply from the bishop. Bishop Conway warned William that he could be leaving himself open to accusations of libel by repeating the rumour of the DPP being godfather to one of the Flynn children. William bought a copy of David Yallop's book, In God's Name, wrote another letter saying that the place should be packed with priests, and posted the book to the bishop. He would never hear from Bishop Conway again. At the district court in Kilbeggan on the 23rd of October, Richard was again represented by Mr. Lysett. This time Mr. Lysett was the one to seek an adjournment on behalf of his client. He explained to Justice Tormey that there were complex matters of fact and law, so they were in the process of instructing counsel. Their barrister would then need to examine the book of evidence and hoped that would happen within the next week. Mr. Houlihan, representing the state, expressed that the DPP was anxious to proceed with the case, but that he would leave the matter for the court to decide. Justice Tormey granted another adjournment until the 27th of November, 1985. At the next sitting, Justice Tormey stated that after reading the book of evidence, he was satisfied that there was sufficient cause to return the accused for trial on both charges. Justice Tormey remanded Richard on bail of £100 with one independent surety of £100. David Flynn went independent surety for his father. Richard Flynn's manslaughter and assault trial was now set for the 4th of February 1986 in Tullamore Circuit Court. The Molloy family were still trying to ascertain what possessions Father Niall owned and where they were. They were beginning to piece together his finances and assets with limited available records. Any written requests sent to the Flynns via their solicitor were being ignored. Mr. Lycett and the Flynns' lack of cooperation was not helping to ascertain Father Niall's estate. Mr. Lycett did, however, on behalf of his client, Teresa Flynn, write to the Bishop of Elphin, the Command Adjutant's office in the Army Barracks in Athlone, and the two executors of Father Niall's will. His letters claim that Teresa Flynn was beneficiary named in Father Niall's will, and as such, she was claiming her interest. When Father Niall's will could not be located, his brother and genuine next of kin, William, was appointed administrator of Father Niall's estate. In Tullamore Circuit Court on the 4th of February 1986, instead of Richard Flynn's trial getting underway, Mr. Lycett made a further application to the court on behalf of his client. In a hearing that took just over a minute, he applied for Richard's trial to be transferred from Tullamore Circuit Court to the Circuit Criminal Court in Dublin. No reason for the application was given, and Justice Peter O'Malley was not obliged to ask why. On the 26th of February, Richard, represented by his barrister, Mr. James Connolly, appeared at a pre-trial hearing in the Circuit Criminal Court in Dublin before Justice Frank Rowe. Justice Rowe fixed the 19th of June 1986 as the date for Richard's trial. By the time his trial date arrived, Richard was in debt to the tune of £115,000. In light of the revelations of the Flynn's finances, the Molloys refused to believe Father Niall was killed because of a row over drink. They would place their faith in the judicial system to expose the truth at Richard Flynn's upcoming trial. In Episode 3, Richard Flynn stands trial for manslaughter and assault in the Circuit Criminal Court in Dublin. Father Niall's family and supporters brace themselves for a lengthy trial. But the direction given to the jury by the trial judge is still considered one of the most controversial legal decisions in the history of Irish law. This series was written, produced and edited by Liv Kerwin. Narrated by Marcus Kerwin. Music, Take Up Your Cross by Onchenko Music. We would like to extend our very special thanks to Mr. Bilmar and Father Niall's family. This series is dedicated to the memory of Joe, Matthew and Tony. This has been a Kurska production.